Hello, scholars. My name is Dr. Karis Dillon, and the goal of this channel is to make academic subjects easier to understand. In the last video, we looked at President Nixon and Watergate, as well as President Ford and Carter. In this video, we're going to look at the presidency of Ronald Reagan and George Bush Sr. In the fall of 1964, Ronald Reagan gave a speech for Barry Goldwater's candidacy for president at the Republican National Committee on television. Reagan had previously given the speech for a Los Angeles news station, which resulted in mass popularity and money for the campaign. Reagan was confident, calm, and persuasive. He was used to being in front of the camera, and he'd been a very successful and popular actor. Even though Barry Goldwater did not win the presidency, Reagan's speech marked the beginning of his political career. Friends and family of Reagan pushed him to run for governor of California in 1965. Reagan was a stable conservative voice in a time where traditional Christian beliefs and values were emphasized. Conservatives stood for school prayer in public schools, stopping divorces between couples, and ending abortion. Jerry Falwell, who was a TV and radio evangelist, founded the Moral Majority, which was a fundamental Christian group set on conservative values. This was also a time when Neo-Conservatism became popular. These conservatives stated that liberals were not strict enough given communist threats. They felt liberals were too willing to give up their own rights to provide for the equality of blacks, women, and/or disabled or disadvantaged. Neo-conservatives demanded a return to pure capitalism and to ignore the social problems of the nation. In the election of 1980, the Democratic candidate, President Jimmy Carter, ran against Republican candidate Ronald Reagan. Jimmy Carter had originally used the Watergate conflict to win the presidency and eventually found himself in trouble with the economy. The unemployment rate was horrible and high inflation afflicted the nation. Ronald Reagan used the horrible economy to score points with the American people. Reagan also used foreign policy in the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union as well as the hostage crisis in Iran to show the faults of Carter. Reagan promised that if the American people elected him president, he would build up the military to massive proportions to keep the Soviets from gaining any control over the world. He carefully promoted the reason for the military buildup as a means to keep worldwide peace. Reagan showed a mastery of presenting his platform in front of the camera and asked the American people if they were better off than they were 4 years before. Those Americans watching him on television knew the answer was no. Ronald Reagan won the election of 1980 and became the President of the United States. Republicans even picked up a majority in the Senate and more than 30 seats in the House. Ronald Reagan officially took office in January of 1981. The value of the American dollar was at 36 cents, and inflation was wreaking havoc on the nation. Many economists believe that if private businesses did not have high taxes or high government spending, that they would focus on investing their extra income into jobs, which would better the economy and create new revenue. Reagan wanted to see a 30% cut in income taxes, believing this would fix the U.S. economy. He did not touch Social Security or Medicare, but was able to slash $40 billion from the nation's budget by reducing food stamps, student loans, mass transit, and public service jobs. Reagan also cut back on federal agencies and wanted government deregulation so that the marketplace could direct the U.S. economy. When Reagan attempted to make cuts to Social Security after Americans realized it was one of the main reasons for the growing budget deficit, Americans grew extremely upset. Over time, and with the help of Congress, legislators were able to make changes in March of 1983 and slowly increase the age of retirement, tax pensions of wealthier elderly, and didn't take the cost of living into their assessments for a couple of years. Reagan also appointed Sandra Day O'Conner, which helped to ease some of the frustrations of Democrats toward his strict policies. Reagan's economic theory of the marketplace correcting itself did not work. A recession arose in 1981 and grew worse in 1982. In the fall of 1982, unemployment rose above 10%. Reagan continued his tax cuts, hoping it would help. After the first 3 months of 1983, the economy began to improve. The 10% cut in the summer helped to improve consumer spending. With improvement in consumer spending, businesses were able to increase their inventories. Even though the economy started to get better, the American people grew quite concerned with the growing deficit. If government spending continued at its current rate, the deficit would hit more than $300 billion by the end of the decade. Congress pushed for spending cuts by 1991. The Democrats knew that increases in spending for social programs would not happen for quite a few years. Japan continued to dominate the American market during the 1980s. American consumers also started to live way beyond their means of what they could afford. Consumers withdrew from their savings and used their credit cards to buy foreign automobiles, VCRs, and TVs. By the end of 1980, American consumers spent more than $60 billion per year on foreign products. They wanted to own everything that their neighbors had. Blue-collar jobs did go down as industries like steel, automobiles, and manufacturing were given to foreign nations because of decreased production costs. Large companies like General Electric and Kodak refused to manufacture anything in the United States because it was so much cheaper to do it elsewhere. When manufacturing and production decreased, the service sector increased rapidly. Healthcare industries, transportation, and financial institutions grew in popularity. The 1990s ushered in employment in executive, professional, or technological positions. The gap between those that had wealth and those that didn't continued to increase. By the end of the 1980s, the top 20% of the population owned 80% of the nation's entire wealth. The middle class was hit the hardest in the U.S. Because President Reagan was able to curtail the economic inflation and drop the unemployment rate of the Carter presidency, it was assumed that he would win the presidential election of 1984. In the election of 1984, Republican candidate Ronald Reagan ran against Democratic candidate Walter Mondale. When Walter Mondale admitted that he would have to raise taxes to stop the climbing national deficit, he probably sealed his own fate. President Ronald Reagan won a second term by an even greater margin than in his first term. Reagan stayed loyal to his original platform to strengthen the military and gain world domination against Russia. Creating and investing in new weapons were part of Reagan's focus. A new B-1 bomber, an MX nuclear missile, and new Navy ships were supposed to be built. Even though there were cuts to domestic spending, there was an increase in the military budget. Reagan did not keep it as a secret that he believed the Soviet Union was a direct enemy to the well-being of the U.S. In 1982, Reagan went before the UN and put down the Russians and all of their actions. Reagan sent out cruise missiles to various portions of Western Europe to match those that had been aimed at NATO countries. These weapons went to Great Britain as well as Germany in 1983. These actions definitely increased the tensions between Russia and the U.S. Reagan and the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, increased their research and development of an anti-missile system that would use lasers to destroy incoming missiles in the air. This research was called Star Wars by the media. During Carter's presidency, he had extended aid to the Sandinista coalition within Nicaragua so they wouldn't align with Cuba or the Soviet Union. Reagan decided to cut this aid, which brought advisors and military assistance from Cuban and Soviet advisors. In April of 1983, President Reagan went to Congress to ask for money to get rid of the Sandinistas. Congress refused, and President Reagan turned to the CIA and covert operations. The CIA started supplying the Contras, who were exiles of the Sandinistas from locations like Costa Rica and Honduras. The Contras started completing raids where they blew up oil tanks, destroyed harbors, and took supplies from villages. In 1984, Congress passed the Boland Amendment, which prohibited a federal agency from providing money to Central America. After this law was passed, the Contras weren't quite sure what they could do anymore. In the middle of 1985, retired Marine officer Robert McFarlane, who was the National Security Advisor, tried to bring back American influence in the Middle East. There were 6 American hostages that were being held in Lebanon by loyalists to Iran's Ayatollah Khomeini. McFarlane proposed a trade of anti-tank missiles for Iran, and in return, the U.S. would get their citizens back. Iranians seemed to like the idea of the trade because they were in desperate need of military weapons in their war against Iraq. McFarlane then went to a young Marine whose name was Oliver North, who was a lieutenant colonel and was part of the National Security Council. Oliver North went to the director of the CIA, who was William Casey, and asked about the trade. Casey liked the idea and felt that the NSC would work well to create a covert operation where he knew he couldn't with the CIA and its congressional oversight. Casey took McFarlane's place and convinced President Reagan to ship TOW anti-tank missiles and Hawk anti-aircraft missiles to Iran. The deal could be accomplished without Congress's knowledge, and Reagan realized this might be the way for his administration to supply the Contras with weapons. Oliver North was put in charge of using the profits from the sale of weapons in Iran to finance the Contras. The act was unconstitutional and illegal. Over time, the press finally learned about the arms sales to Iran. North went ahead and destroyed any documents that would show a crime. He made sure that President Reagan would not be found to be involved in any of the actions. In 1987, President Reagan began to change course in his policies toward the Soviet Union. His wife, Nancy Reagan, talked at length with her husband about forming a peaceful relationship with the Soviet Union. When Mikhail Gorbachev was finally selected as the leader of the Soviet Union, he also voiced his intent to improve relations with the U.S. Perestroika was his new policy, which meant restructuring the Soviet economy, and Glasnost, which meant political openness, were going to be ways that Gorbachev would work with the U.S. to slow the military buildup of the Cold War. Reagan and Gorbachev met for the first time in Geneva in 1985, but no agreements were able to be made. Strides were made in October of 1986 at Reykjavik, Iceland, also reaching a historic breakthrough. Both Gorbachev and Reagan needed a foreign policy triumph, and various experts worked on an intermediate nuclear forces agreement to create the largest disarmament agreement since 1972. In 1987, they met again in Washington and agreed to get rid of all intermediate range missiles and allow inspections. A virus outbreak in the early 1980s was of great concern to many Americans, but was mostly ignored by President Reagan. Acquired immune deficiency syndrome, AIDS, was the name of the virus that first appeared in New York and San Francisco emergency rooms. The symptoms included a rare pneumonia and an odd type of skin cancer. The individuals that were showing up with these symptoms were mostly male. It was several years before the symptoms would be identified as human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV. Soon, researchers and doctors noticed that IV drug users and those that needed frequent blood transfusions were showing positive tests. It then became known that the virus could spread via bodily fluids such as blood or semen, and not by general contact from one human to the next. But by November of 1983, there were 2,803 known cases of HIV and AIDS, and over 1,400 deaths from the virus. By 1985, there were over 6,000 deaths. New drugs were being invented or were used in experimental modes, but these drugs often cost the sick more than $15,000 a year for them. Another domestic problem that arose in the 1980s was the use of cocaine within America. Those that had significant money tended to be the ones that used cocaine on a regular basis because it was really expensive. It cost about $100 to get high from cocaine. Cocaine helped people to feel instantly happy, but the dangers of dying were really high. The creation of crack, a cheaper form of cocaine, could be smoked in a pipe and provided users with a very high and intense feeling. Crack was sold for $10 a dose, but the high didn't last long. Because a crack high didn't last long, users needed more and more to keep their highs, which meant they needed more money to fill their habits. In 1987, 70% of individuals arrested for burglary also tested positive for cocaine in their bodies. First Lady Nancy Reagan chose drug education as her focus to work toward within the White House and to create a program that could be taught in various school districts. Just Say No was the First Lady's slogan that she introduced in churches, schools, and civic groups. She talked at length about the dangers of cocaine. The Reagan administration tried to work with governments within Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia to stop the trade of cocaine, but it wasn't very successful. Cocoa leaves could make 5 times the amount of money that any food crop could bring. President Bush didn't do any better with stopping the flow of drugs from Central America to the United States. When 8 different leaders of the cartel were arrested, the flow of illegal drugs just continued. President Reagan was able to appoint William Rehnquist to the Supreme Court when Chief Justice Warren Burger decided to retire. He later attempted to appoint Robert Bork to the court in 1987, but was blocked by legislators. Reagan was then successfully able to appoint Anthony Kennedy to the court. President Bush also made appointments to the Supreme Court. His first appointment was David H. Souter, with just a bit of controversy. Bush's second appointment was much more problematic. When President Bush chose Clarence Thomas as his choice for the Supreme Court, professor from the University of Oklahoma came forward and accused Thomas of sexual harassment. Her name was Anita Hill, and she testified before Congress that she'd been employed by him many years beforehand and that he did some very questionable acts that I really can't talk about here. Feel free to look them up online if you're interested and you want to understand that appointment better. Clarence Thomas ended up being appointed to the Supreme Court by a very small margin. The election of 1988 proved to be very interesting. George Bush was chosen as the Republican nominee, whereas Michael Dukakis was chosen as the Democratic nominee. Bush was a stronger candidate than anyone expected, and he stated that Democrats were too soft on crime. His famous line in campaigning was, "Read my lips, no new taxes." George Bush won the presidency, but the Democrats controlled the Senate and the House of Representatives. President Bush did as he was expected and vetoed legislation about family leave, healthcare reform, and civil rights legislation. He did help to pass the Americans with Disability Act, the ADA, in 1991, which made it illegal to discriminate against disabled persons in hiring, in public places, and on public transportation. Beyond the ADA and its regulations, President Bush was concerned with a growing deficit as well as the savings and loans industries. Bush eventually went against his campaign pledge of no new taxes and increased taxes on the wealthy and cut spending within the military. Even though Bush tried hard to cut government spending, the national debt still grew by $1 trillion by the end of his presidency. In May of 1989, Chinese students began demonstrating in Beijing's Tiananmen Square. The students wanted democracy within their country and put themselves on a hunger strike in protest of the communist government. On June 4th, the Chinese government sent in military tanks and soldiers to send a message to the demonstrators. Within 24 to 48 hours, hundreds of Chinese students were killed and thousands were wounded. Americans were so upset by the treatment of the students, but President Bush continued to keep good relations with the Chinese government because their economies were intertwined. In June of 1989, Lech Walesa and the movement called Solidarity protested for free elections in the country of Poland. The nation of Hungary forced open its borders to those in the West. It didn't take long before the nations of Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Germany started to fall. In November of that same year, that was when the Berlin Wall fell. Most people believe that Mikhail Gorbachev was the main reason for these various liberations. On August 19, 1991, a right-wing coup placed Gorbachev under house arrest. Boris Yeltsin, who was the newly elected president of the Russian Republic, came to his aid and demanded his release. The Red Army remained loyal to Yeltsin, and as military pressure increased, Gorbachev was finally set free. He resigned his position in the last month of 1991. Russia, which was the largest republic, decided to join with 10 of the other unions and form an alignment which would be known as the Commonwealth of Independent States. President Bush was extremely glad to see communism fall and offered Russia and other members of the CIS economic assistance. Another significant development took place on August 2, 1990, when the leader of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, invaded Kuwait and the Persian Gulf, which was a massively rich oil region. President Bush worked with the United Nations and accused the Iraqi leader of aggression. In talks with the nation of Saudi Arabia, Bush was able to send American troops to the region, which eventually became known as Desert Shield. 50% of the U.S. oil that came in each day came from this region. President Bush continued to work with the UN, and eventually they agreed to use force to free Kuwait from the Iraqis. On January 17, 1991, F-117A stealth fighters and Tomahawk cruise missiles hit targets in Baghdad. Iraqi command and control centers were demolished, and the Iraqis had virtually no ability to fight back. This action would be known as the Desert Storm. After 5 weeks, President Bush gave the order for General H. Norman Schwarzkopf to sweep across the desert along with U.S. Marines and push right into Kuwait City. Within 100 hours, American forces, along with Saudi forces, freed Kuwait, and Iraqi forces fled back to Iraq. Many Americans did not want to stop there. They wanted to move into Iraq and capture Saddam Hussein so he would never be a threat again. Those that opposed moving into Iraq stated that they did not want another incident like Vietnam. 146 American lives were lost in the first war to liberate Kuwait, and the American nation agreed that its mission had been completed. Saddam Hussein did continue to rule in Iraq and built his military back up to unexpected levels that Americans would not anticipate. Saddam Hussein was a vicious leader who killed Kurdish people in northern Iraq as well as Shiite Muslims in southern Iraq. America didn't realize that they would have to face Saddam Hussein again in 2003, and the second invasion would be much different than the first. Well, that is the end of the video. I hope that you enjoyed it, and if you did, please click that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe. I hope you have an amazing day, and I will talk with you soon.